The Everlasting Man, Part 4, Section 3, The Antiquity of Civilization. The modern man looking at the most ancient origins has been like a man watching for daybreak in a strange land, and expecting to see that dawn breaking from behind bare uplands or solitary peaks. But that dawn is breaking behind the black bulk of great cities long builded and lost for us in the original night. Colossal cities like the houses of giants, in which even the carved ornamental animals are taller than the palm trees, in which the painted portrait can be 12 times the size of the man, with tombs like mountains of man set foursquare and pointing to the stars, the winged and bearded bulls standing and staring enormous at the gates of temples, standing still eternally as if a stamp would shake the world. The dawn of history reveals a humanity already civilized. Perhaps it reveals a civilization already old. And among others, more important things, it reveals the folly of most of the generalizations about the previous and unknown period when it was really young. The first two human societies of which we have had any reliable and detailed record are Babylon and Egypt. It so happens that these two vast and splendid achievements of the genius of the ancients bear witness against two of the commonest and crudest assumption of the culture of the moderns. If we want to get rid of half the nonsense about nomads and cavemen and the old man of the forest, we need only look steadily at two solid and stupendous facts called Egypt and Babylon. Of course, most of these speculators who are talking about primitive men are thinking about modern savages. They prove their progressive evolution by assuming that a great part of the human race has not progressed or evolved, or even changed in any way at all. I do not agree with their theory of change, nor do I agree with their dogma of things unchangeable. I may not believe that civilized man has had so rapid and recent a progress, but I cannot quite understand why uncivilized man should be so mystically immortal and immutable. A somewhat simpler mode of thought and speech seems to me to be needed throughout this inquiry. Modern savages cannot be exactly like primitive men, because they are not primitive. Modern savages are not ancient because they are modern. Something has happened to their race as much as to ours, during the thousands of years of our existence and endurance on the earth. They have had some experiences, and have presumably acted on them, if not profited by them, like the rest of us. They have had some environment, and even some change of environment, and have presumably adapted themselves to it in a proper and decorous evolutionary manner. This would be true even if the experiences were mild or the environment dreary, for there is an effect in mere time when it takes the moral form of monotony. But it has appeared to a good many intelligent and well-informed people quite as probable that the experience of the savages has been that of a decline from civilization. Most of those who criticize this view do not seem to have any very clear notion of what a decline from civilization would be like. Heaven help them. It is likely enough they will soon find out. They seem to be content if cavemen and cannibal islanders have something in common, such as certain particular implements. But it is obvious on the face of it that any peoples reduced for any reason to a ruder life will have had some things in common. If we lost all our firearms, we should make bows and arrows, but we should not necessarily resemble in every way the first men who made bows and arrows. It is said that the Russians in their great retreat were so short of armament that they fought with clubs cut in the wood. But a professor of the future would err in supposing that the Russian army of 1916 was a naked Scythian tribe that had never been out of the wood. It is like saying that a man in his second childhood must exactly copy his first. A baby is bald like an old man, but it would be an error for one ignorant of infancy to infer that the baby had a long white beard. Both a baby and an old man walk with difficulty, but he who shall expect the old gentleman to lie on his back and kick joyfully instead will be disappointed. It is therefore absurd to argue that the first pioneers of humanity must have been identical with some of the last and the most stagnant leavings of it. There were almost certainly some things, there were probably many things, in which the two were widely different or flatly contrary. An example of the way in which this distinction works, and an example essential to our argument here, is that of the nature and origin of government. I have already alluded to Mr. H. G. Wells and the old man, with whom he appears to be on such intimate terms. If we considered the cold facts of prehistoric evidence for this portrait of the prehistoric chief of the tribe, we could only excuse it by saying that its brilliant and versatile author simply forgot for a moment that he was supposed to be writing a history, and dreamed he was writing one of his very wonderful and imaginative romances. At least I cannot imagine how he can possibly know that the prehistoric ruler was called the old man, or that court etiquette requires it to be spelt with capital letters. He says of the same potentate, no one was allowed to touch his spear or to sit in his seat. I have difficulty in believing that anyone has dug up a prehistoric spear with a prehistoric label, visitors are requested not to touch, or a complete throne with the inscription, reserved for the old man. But it may be presumed that the writer, who can hardly be supposed to be merely making up things out of his own head, was merely taking for granted this very dubious parallel between the prehistoric and decivilized man. It may be that in certain savage tribes the chief is called the old man, and nobody is allowed to touch his spear or sit on his seat. It may be that in those cases he is surrounded with superstitious and traditional terrors, and it may be that in those cases, for all I know, he is despotic and tyrannical. But there is not a grain of evidence that primitive government was despotic and tyrannical. It may have been, of course, but it may have been anything or even nothing. It may not have existed at all. But the despotism in certain dingy and decayed tribes in the 20th century does not prove that the first men were ruled despotically. It does not even suggest it. It does not even begin to hint at it. If there is one fact we really can prove from history that we really do know, it is that despotism can be a development, often a late development, and very often indeed the end of societies that have been highly democratic. A despotism may also be defined as a tired democracy. As fatigue falls on a community, the citizens are less inclined for that eternal vigilance which has truly been called the price of liberty. They prefer to arm only one single sentinel to watch the city while they sleep. It is also true that they sometimes needed him for some sudden and militant act of reform. It is equally true that he often took advantage of being the strong man, armed to be a tyrant like some of the sultans of the East. But I cannot see why the sultan should have appeared any earlier in history than many other human figures. On the contrary, the strong man armed obviously depends upon the superiority of his armor, and armament of that sort comes with more complex civilization. One man may kill 20 with a machine gun. It is obviously less likely that he could do it with a piece of flint. As for the current cant about the strongest man ruling by force and fear, it is simply a nursery fairy tale about a giant with 100 hands. 20 men could hold down the strongest man in any society, ancient or modern. Undoubtedly they might admire, in a romantic and poetical sense, the man who was really the strongest. But that is quite a different thing, as it is purely moral and even mystical, as the admiration for the purest or the wisest. But the spirit that endures the mere cruelties and caprices of an established despot is the spirit of the ancient and settled and probably stiffened society, not the spirit of a new one. As his name implies, the old man is a ruler of an old humanity. It is far more probable that a primitive society was something like a pure democracy. To this day, the comparatively simple agricultural communities are by far the purest democracies. Democracy is a thing which is always breaking down through the complexity of civilization. Anyone who likes may state it by saying that a democracy is the foe of civilization. But he must remember that some of us really prefer democracy to civilization, and in the sense of preferring democracy to complexity. Anyhow, peasants tilling patches of their own land in a rough equality, and meeting to vote directly under a village tree, are the most truly self-governing of men. It is surely as likely as not that such a simple idea was found in the first condition of even simpler men. Indeed, the despotic vision is exaggerated, even if we do not regard the men as men. Even on an evolutionary assumption of the most materialist sort, there is really no reason why men should not have had at least as much camaraderie as rats or rooks. Leadership of some sort they doubtless had, as have the gregarious animals, but leadership implies no such irrational servility as that attributed to the superstitious subjects of the old man. There was doubtless some body corresponding, to use Tennyson's expression, to the many-wintered crow that leads the clanging rookery home. But I fancy that if that venerable fowl began to act after the fashion of some sultans in ancient and decayed Asia, it would become a very clanging rookery, and the many-wintered crow would not see many more winters. It may be remarked in this connection, but even among animals it would seem that something else is respected more than bestial violence. If it is only the familiarity which in men is called tradition, or the experience which in men is called wisdom. I do not know if crows really follow the oldest crow, but if they do, they are certainly not following the strongest crow. And I do know, in the human case, that if some ritual of seniority keeps savages referencing someone called the old man, then at least they have not our own servile sentimental weakness for worshipping the strong man. It may be said, then, that primitive government, like primitive art and religion and everything else, is very imperfectly known, or rather guessed at, but that it is at least as good a guess to suggest that it was as popular as a Balkan or Pyrenean village as it was as capricious and secret as a Turkish divan. But the mountain democracy and the oriental palace are modern in the sense that they are still there, or are some sort of growth of history. But of the two, the palace has much more the look of being an accumulation and a corruption, the village much more the look of being a really unchanged and primitive thing. But my suggestions at this point do not go beyond expressing a wholesome doubt about the current assumption. I think it is interesting, for instance, that liberal institutions have been traced back, even by moderns, to barbarians or undeveloped states, when it happened to be convenient for the support of some race or nation or philosophy. So the socialists profess that their ideal of communal property existed in very early times. So the Jews are proud of the jubilees or juster redistributions under their ancient law. So the Teutonists, boasting of tracing parliaments and juries and various popular things among the Germanic tribes of the north. So the Celtophiles and those testifying to the wrongs of Ireland have pleaded the more equal justice of the clan system, to which the Irish chiefs bore witness before Strongbow. The strength of the case varies in various cases, but there is some case for all of them. I suspect there is some case for the general proposition that popular institutions of some sort were by no means uncommon in early and simple societies. Each of these separate schools were making the admission to prove a particular modern thesis, but taken together they suggest a more ancient and general truth, that there was something more in prehistoric councils than ferocity and fear. Each of these separate theorists had his own axe to grind, but he was willing to use a stone axe, and he manages to suggest that the stone axe might have been as republican as the guillotine. But the truth is that the curtain rises upon the play already in progress. In one sense, it is a true paradox that there was history before history, but it is not the irrational paradox implied in prehistoric history, for it is a history we do not know. Very probably it was exceedingly like the history we do know, except in the one detail that we do not know it. It is thus the very opposite of the pretentious prehistoric history, which professes to trace everything in a consistent course from the amoeba to the anthropoid, and from the anthropoid to the agnostic. So far from being a question of our knowing all about queer creatures very different from ourselves, they were probably people very like ourselves, except that we know nothing about them. In other words, our most ancient records only reach back to a time when humanity had not been human, and even long been civilized. The most ancient records we have not only mentioned, but take for granted things like kings and priests and princes and assemblies of the people. They describe communities that are roughly recognizable as communities in our own sense. Some of them are despotic, but we cannot tell that they have always been despotic. Some of them may be already decadent, and nearly all are mentioned as if they were old. We do not know what really happened in the world before these records, but the little we do know would leave us anything but astonished if we learned that it was very much like what happens in the world now. There would be nothing inconsistent or confounding about the discovery that those unknown ages were full of republics collapsing under monarchies and rising again as republics, empires expanding and finding colonies and then losing colonies, kingdoms combining again into world states and breaking up into small nationalities, classes selling themselves into slavery and marching out once more into liberty. All that procession of humanity, which may or may not be a progress, but most assuredly a romance. But the first chapters of the romance have been torn out of the book, and we shall never read them. It is also with the more special fancy about evolution and social stability. According to the real records available, barbarism and civilization were not successive states in the progress of the world. They were conditions that existed side by side, as they still exist side by side. There were civilizations then as there are civilizations now. There are savages now as there were savages then. It is suggested that all men pass through a nomadic stage, but it is certain that there are some who have never passed out of it, and it seems not unlikely that there were some who never passed into it. It is probable that from the very primitive times the static tiller of the soil and the wandering shepherd were two distinct types of men, and the chronological rearrangement of them is but a mark of that mania for progressive stages that have largely falsified history. It is suggested that there was a communist stage, in which private property was everywhere unknown, a whole humanity living on the negation of property, but the evidence of this negation are themselves rather negative. Redistributions of property, jubilees, and agrarian laws occur at various intervals and in various forms, but that humanity inevitably passed through a communist stage seems as doubtful as the parallel proposition that humanity will inevitably return to it. It is chiefly interesting as evidence that the boldest plans for the future invoke the authority of the past, and that even a revolutionary seeks to satisfy himself that he is also a reactionary. There is an amusing parallel example in the case of what we call feminism. In spite of all the pseudo-scientific gossip about marriage by capture and the cavemen beating the cave woman with a club, it may be noted that as soon as feminism became a fashionable cry, it was insisted that human civilization in its first stage had been a matriarchy. Apparently it was the cave woman who carried the club. Anyhow, all these ideas are little better than guesses. They have a curious way of following the fortune of modern theories and fads. In any case, they are not history in the sense of record, and we may repeat that when it comes to record, the broad truth is that barbarism and civilization have always dwelt side by side in the world. The civilization sometimes spreading to absorb the barbarians, sometimes decaying into relative barbarism, and in almost all cases possessed of a more finished form, certain ideas and institutions which the barbarians possess in a ruder form, such as government or social authority, the arts, and especially the decorative arts, mysteries and taboos of various kinds, especially surrounding the matter of sex, and some form of that fundamental thing which is the chief concern of this inquiry, the thing that we call religion. Now, Egypt and Babylon, those two primeval monsters, might in this matter have been specially provided as models. They might almost be called working models to show how these modern theories do not work. The two great truths we know about these two great cultures happen to contradict flatly the two current fallacies which we have just considered. The story of Egypt might have been invented to point the moral that man does not necessarily begin with despotism because he is barbarous, but often finds his way to despotism because he is civilized. He finds it because he is experienced, or, what is often much the same thing, because he is exhausted. And the story of Babylon might have been invented to point the moral that man need not be a nomad or a communist before he becomes a peasant or a citizen, and that such cultures are not always in successive stages, but often in contemporary states. Even touching these great civilizations with which our written history begins, there is a temptation, of course, to be too ingenious and too cocksure. We can read the bricks of Babylon in a different sense from that in which we guess about the cup and ring stones. And we do definitely know that what is meant by animals in the Egyptian hieroglyphic, as we know nothing of the animal in the Neolithic cave. But even here, the admirable archaeologists who have deciphered line after line of miles of hieroglyphics may be tempted to read too much between the lines. Even the real authority of Babylon may forget how fragmentary in his hard-won knowledge, may forget that Babylon has only heaved half a brick at him, though half a brick is better than no cuneiform. But some truths, historic and not prehistoric, dogmatic and not evolutionary, facts and not fancies, do indeed emerge from Egypt and Babylon, and these two truths are among them. Egypt is a green ribbon along the river edging the dark red desolation of the desert. It is a proverb, and one of vast antiquity, that it was created by the mysterious bounty and almost sinister benevolence of the Nile. When we first hear of Egyptians, they are living as in a string of riverside villages, in nice and separate but cooperative communities along the banks of the Nile. Where the river branched into the broad delta, there was traditionally the beginning of a somewhat different district or people. But this need not complicate the main truth. These more or less independent, though interdependent people were considered civilized already. They had a sort of heraldry, that is, decorative art used for symbolic and social purposes. each sailing the Nile under its own ensign, representing some bird or animal. Heraldry involved two things of enormous importance to normal humanity, the combination of the two making that noble thing called cooperation, on which rest all peasantries and peoples that are free. The art of heraldry means independence, an image chosen by the imagination to express the individuality. The science of heraldry means interdependence, an agreement between different bodies to recognize different images, a science of imagery. We have here, therefore, exactly that compromise of cooperation between free families or groups which is the most normal mode of life for humanity, and is particularly apparent that wherever men own their own land and live on it. With the very mention of the image of bird and beast, and student of mythology will murmur the word totem almost in his sleep. But to my mind much of the trouble arises from his habit of saying such words as if in his sleep. Throughout this rough outline, I have made a necessarily inadequate attempt to keep on the inside rather than outside of such things, to consider them where possible in terms of thought and not merely in terms of terminology. There is very little value in talking about totems unless we have some feeling of what it really felt like to have a totem. Granted that they had totems and we have no totems. Was it because they had more fear of animals or more familiarity with animals? Did a man whose totem was a wolf feel like a werewolf or like a man running away from a werewolf? Did he feel like Uncle Remus about Brer Wolf, or like St. Francis about his brother the wolf, or like Mowgli about his brothers the wolves? Was a totem a thing like the British lion, or a thing like the British bulldog? Was the worship of a totem like the feeling of niggers about mumbo jumbo, or of children about jumbo? I have never read any book of folklore, however learned, that gave me any light upon this question, which I think by far the most important one. I will confine myself to repeating that the earliest Egyptian communities had a common understanding about the images that stood for their individual states, that this amount of communication is prehistoric in the sense that it is already there at the beginning of history. But as history unfolds itself, this question of communication is clearly the main question of these riverside communities. With the need of communication comes the need of a common government and the growing greatness and spreading shadow of the king. The other binding force, besides the king, and perhaps older than the king, is the priesthood. And the priesthood has presumably even more to do with these ritual symbols and signals by which men can communicate. And here in Egypt arose, probably the primary and certainly the typical invention to which we owe all history, and the whole difference between the historic and the prehistoric, the archetypal script, the art of writing. The popular pictures of these primeval empires are not half so popular as they might be. There is shed over them the shadow of an exaggerated gloom, more than the normal or even healthy sadness of heathen men. It is part of the same sort of secret pessimism that loves to make primitive man a crawling creature, whose body is filth and whose soul is fear. It comes, of course, from the fact that men are moved most by their religion, especially when it is irreligion. For them, anything primary and elemental must be evil. But it is the curious consequence that while we have been deluged with the wildest experiments in primitive romance, they have all missed the real romance of being primitive. They have described scenes that are wholly imaginary, in which the men of the Stone Age are men of stone like the walking statues, in which the Assyrians or Egyptians are as stiff or as painted as their most archaic art. But none of these makers of imaginary scenes have tried to imagine what it must really have been like to see those things as fresh, which we now see as familiar. They have not seen a man discovering fire like a child discovering fireworks. They have not seen a man playing with the wonderful invention called the wheel, like a boy playing at putting up a wireless station. They have never put the spirit of youth into their descriptions of the youth of the world. It follows that amid all their primitive and prehistoric fancies there are no jokes. There are not even practical jokes in connection with the practical inventions. And this is very sharply defined in that particular case of hieroglyphics, for there seems to be a serious indication that the whole human art of scripture or writing began with a joke. There are some who will learn with regret that it seems to have begun with a pun. The king or the priests or some responsible persons, wishing to send a message up the river in that inconveniently long and narrow territory, hit on the idea of sending it in picture writing, like that of the Red Indian. Like most people who have written picture writing for fun, he found the words did not always fit. But when the word for taxes sounded rather like the word for pig, he boldly put down a pig as a bad pun and chanced it. So a modern hieroglyphist might represent at once by unscrupulously drawing a hat followed by a series of upright numerals. It was good enough for the pharaohs and ought to be good enough for him. But it must have been great fun to write or even read these messages, when writing and reading were really a new thing. And if people must write romances about ancient Egypt, and it seems that neither prayers nor tears nor curses can withhold them from the habit, I suggest that scenes like this would be really remind us that the ancient Egyptians were human beings. I suggest that somebody should describe the scene of the great monarch sitting among his priests, all of them roaring with laughter and bubbling over with suggestions as the royal puns grew more and more wild and indefensible. There might be another scene of almost equal excitement about the decoding of this cipher, the guesses and clues and discoveries having all the important thrill of a detective story. That is how primitive romance and primitive history really ought to be written. For whatever was the quality of the religious or moral life of remote times, and it was probably much more human than is conventionally supposed, the scientific interest of such time must have been intense. Words must have been more wonderful than wireless telegraphy, and experiments with common things a series of electric shocks. We are still waiting for someone to write a lively story of primitive life. The point is, in some sense, a parenthesis here, but is connected with the general matter of political development by the institution which was most active in these first and most fascinating of all fairy tales of science. It is admitted that we owe most of this science to the priests. Modern writers like Mr. Wells cannot be accused of any weakness of sympathy with a pontifical hierarchy, but they agree at least in recognizing what pagan priesthoods did for the arts and sciences. Among the more ignorant of the enlightened was indeed a convention of saying that priests had obstructed progress in all ages, and a politician once told me in a debate that I was resisting modern reforms exactly as some ancient priest probably resisted the discovery of wheels. I pointed out, in reply, that it was far more likely the ancient priest made the discovery of the wheels. It is overwhelmingly probable that the ancient priest had a great deal to do with the discovery of the art of writing. It is obvious enough in the fact that the very word hieroglyphic is akin to the word hierarchy. The religion of these priests was apparently a more or less tangled polytheism of a type that is more particularly described elsewhere. It passed through a period when it cooperated with the king, another period when it was temporarily destroyed by the king, who happened to be a prince with a private theism of his own, and a third period when it practically destroyed the king and ruled in his stead. But the world has to thank it for many things which it considered common and necessary. And the creators of those common things really ought to have a place among the heroes of humanity. If we were at rest in real paganism, instead of being restless in a rather irrational reaction from Christianity, we might pay some sort of pagan honor to these nameless makers of mankind. We might have veiled statues of the man who first found fire, or the man who first made a boat, or the man who first tamed a horse. But if we brought them garlands or sacrifices, there would be more sense in it than in disfiguring our cities with cockney statues of stale politicians and philanthropists. But one of the strange marks of the strength of Christianity is that, since it came, no pagan in our civilization has been able to be really human. The point is here, however, that the Egyptian government, whether pontifical or royal, found it more and more necessary to establish communication. And there always went with communication a certain element of coercion. It is not necessarily an indefensible thing that the state grew more despotic as it grew more civilized. It is arguable that it had to grow more despotic in order to grow more civilized. That is the argument for the autocracy in every age, and the interest lies in seeing it illustrated in the earliest stage. But it is emphatically not true that it was the most despotic in the earliest stage and grew more liberal in a later stage. The practical process of history is exactly the reverse. It is not true that the tribe began in the extreme of terror of the old man and his seat and spear. It is probable, at least in Egypt, that the old man was rather a new man armed to attack new conditions. His spear grew longer and longer, and his throne rose higher and higher, as Egypt rose into a complex and complete civilization. What That is what I mean by saying that the histories of the Egyptian territory in this, the history of the earth, and directly denies the vulgar assumption that terrorism can only come at the beginning and cannot come at the end. We do not know what was the first condition of the more or less feudal amalgam of landowners, peasants, and slaves in the little commonwealths beside the Nile. But it may have been a peasantry of an even more popular sort. What we do know is that it was by experience and education the little commonwealths lose their liberty, that absolute sovereignty is something not merely ancient, but rather relatively modern, and it is at the end of the path called progress that men return to the king. Egypt exhibits, in that brief record of its remotest beginnings, the primary problem of liberty and civilization. It is the fact that men actually lose variety by complexity. We have not solved the problem properly any more than they did, but it vulgarizes the human dignity of the problem itself to suggest that even tyranny has no motive save in tribal error. And just as the Egyptian example refutes the fallacy about despotism and civilization, so does the Babylonian example refute the fallacy about civilization and barbarism. Babylon also, we first hear of it when it was already civilized, for the simple reason that we cannot hear of anything until it is educated enough to talk. It talks to us in what is called cuneiform, that strange and stiff triangular symbolism that contrasts with the picturesque alphabet of Egypt. However relatively rigid Egyptian art may be, there is always something different from the Babylonian spirit, which was too rigid to have any art. There is always a living grace in the lines of the lotus, and something of rapidity as well as rigidity in the movement of the arrows and the birds. Perhaps there is something of the restrained but living curve of the river, which makes us, in talking of the serpent of old Nile, almost think of the Nile as a serpent. Babylon was a civilization of diagrams rather than drawings. Mr. W. B. Yeats, who has a historical imagination to match his mythological imagination, and indeed the former is impossible without the latter, wrote truly of the men who watched the stars from their pedantic Babylon. The cuneiform was cut upon bricks, of which all their architecture was built up. The bricks were of baked mud, and perhaps the material had something in it forbidding the sense of form to develop in sculpture or relief. Theirs was a static but a scientific civilization, far advanced in the machinery of life, and in some ways highly modern. It is said that they had much of the modern cult of the higher spinsterhood, and recognized an official class of independent working women. There is, perhaps, something in that mighty stronghold of hardened mud that suggests the utilitarian activity of the huge hive. But though it was huge, it was human. We see many of the same social problems as in ancient Egypt or modern England. And whatever its evils, this was also one of the earliest masterpieces of man. It stood, of course, in the triangle formed by the almost legendary rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates, and the vast agriculture of its empire, on which its towns depended, was perfected by a highly scientific system of canals. It had, by tradition, a highly intellectual life, though rather philosophic than artistic, and there preside over its primal foundation those figures who have come to stand for the star-gazing wisdom of antiquity, the teachers of Abraham, the Chaldees. Against this solid society, as against some vast bare wall of brick, there surged, age after age, the nameless armies of the nomads. They came out of the deserts where the nomadic life had been lived from the beginning, and where it is still lived today. It is needless to dwell on the nature of that life. It was obvious enough, and even easy enough, to follow a herd or a flock which generally found its own grazing ground, and to live on the milk or meat it provided. Nor is there any reason to doubt that this habit of life could give almost every human being everything except a home. Many such shepherds or herdsmen may have talked in the earliest time of all the truths and enigmas of the book of Job, and of these were Abraham and his children, who have given to the modern world for endless enigma the almost monomaniac monotheism of the Jews. But they were a wild people without comprehension of complex social organization, and a spirit like the wind within them made them wage war on it again and again. The history of Babylonia is largely the history of its defense against the desert hordes, who came on at intervals of a century or two, and generally retreated as they came. Some say that an admixture of nomad invasion built at Nineveh the arrogant kingdom of the Assyrians, who carved great monsters upon their temples, bearded bulls with wings like cherubim, and who sent forth many military conquerors who stamped the world as if with such colossal hooves. Assyria was an imperial interlude, but it was an interlude. The main story of all that land is a war between the wandering people and the state that was truly static. Presumably in prehistoric times, and certainly in historic times, those wanderers went westward to waste whatever they could find. The last time they came, they found Babylon vanished, but that was in historic times, and the name of their leader was Muhammad. Now it is worthwhile to pause upon that story because, as has been suggested, it directly contradicts the impression still current that nomadism is merely a prehistoric thing and social settlement a comparatively recent thing. There is nothing to show that the Babylonians had ever wandered. There is very little to show that the tribes of the desert ever settled down. Indeed, it is probable that this notion of a nomadic stage followed by a static stage has already been abandoned by the sincere and genuine scholars to whose researches we all owe so much. But I am not at issue in this book with sincere and genuine scholars, but with a vast and vague opinion, which has been prematurely spread from certain imperfect investigations, and which has made fashionable a false notion of the whole history of humanity. It is the whole vague notion that a monkey evolved into a man, and in the same way a barbarian evolved into a civilized man, and therefore at every stage we have to look back at barbarism and forward it to civilization. Unfortunately, this notion is in a double sense entirely in the air. It is an atmosphere in which men live rather than a thesis which they can defend. Men in that mood are more easily answered by objects than by theories, and it will be well if anyone attempted to make that assumption, and in trivial turn of talk or writing can be checked for a moment by shutting the eyes and seeing for an instant, vast and vaguely crowded, like a populous precipice, the wonder of the Babylonian wall.